Constitution shall be amended to include the right to food in Article 4. A couple of months ago, the Constitution was amended to recognize the direct application in Mexico of international human rights treaties. And these are certainly points of departure that you can use, leverage points you can use to push the government to move towards the full realization of right to food in a number of ways. And I'm not going to detail these ways here. In part, they will be listed in my report. In part, because of lack of time. But essentially, this constitutional amendment is not an arrival point, it's a departure point for what I think should become a national strategy of Mexico towards the realization of right to food that should be developed in a participatory fashion, as recommended by a number of human rights bodies, including the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. And in fact, when on Monday I shall deliver my end of mission statement, I will refer in some detail to what the next steps are. And it is these next steps which I discussed recently at the Senate the day before yesterday, where we examined with a number of interested parliamentarians what the next steps could be. So it's a very interesting moment. My mission arrives at a time where I hope to identify the various points on which now action should be taken in order to give concrete life to this constitutional amendment. Otherwise, it's just a paper. It will be worth nothing if the government, the parliament, and the judiciary do not take further action. So having said this, I'm most grateful for the information you provided me with. I have a few questions, which essentially shall serve to improve my understanding of the issues in order for me to finalize my report with the best information possible. And let me begin perhaps by the issue that Silvia Ribeiro with others, Mercedes Garcia Lara and Josefina Santiago also raised this issue of GM seeds, GM maize, transgenic maize. Yes, I studied this in some detail. What I would like to say is that the situation of Mexico is quite specific, given not just the fact that it's the center of origin of maize globally, and we know that recent studies show how much more diverse maize is in Mexico than we thought, and how farmers since how many, 5,000 years have been domesticating maize, 10,000 maybe, without this process being interrupted. And I'm completely aware, I think, those who know my work know this, of the importance of agrobiodiversity in the context of climate change, right? And the need for us to be prepared with diversity against the challenges that are ahead of us. I am aware that there are risks in the trials that are now being implemented. In trials implemented without following the recommendations of the Comisión Nacional para el Conocimiento y Uso de la Biodiversidad, CONABIO Commission. I'm going to explore this in my report in some detail, and one of the questions I shall have is whether a different approach would not be possible. One that would reward farmers for their contribution to agrobiodiversity. Some of you may be familiar with the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture, which is basically a tool that is meant to encourage communities to continue to develop different plant species, and with financial incentives, right? And that would be a very different approach to how to develop maize in Mexico. I will also explore whether ILO Convention number 169 on the rights of indigenous peoples, which Mexico has ratified, should not be read in the light of the threat to traditional farming systems, seed systems, as a result of the dissemination of GM maize in the environment, right? And this dissemination is, of course, the result of pollination across fields, but it also is simply the result of the fact that in Mexico, the vast majority of farmers depend on exchanges amongst themselves. So that's how seeds get disseminated, and it's clearly a very important risk if the experiment goes wrong, that one day farmers discover that they're actually buying GM seeds, right? So there are reasons to be worried, but on Monday I shall be more explicit on this issue, and I shall present my preliminary conclusions then. And allow me not to be too explicit now, just because that is the constraint in which we are in these missions. We listen to many parties. I was this morning, in fact, at the Secretariat for the Environment, discussing these issues, and I'm now building my knowledge on these issues, but these are some of the reflections that come to mind as I move in my understanding. My sense is that we need, in this national strategy for the right to food, to link agriculture to nutrition to health. Because I don't think we can distinguish health, access to nutritious foods and diverse diets, we cannot delink that from the way agriculture is being subsidized. The focus on major grains produced in the north at the expense of more diverse foods produced by local producers. And I believe that short food chains are one way to improve the diets, which means that we need to relocalize the food systems. I also think, but I may be wrong, and I'm asking for your advice, that unless we change the prices, it's not just by awareness-raising information campaigns that we will solve the problem, right? We must make fresh, adequate food more affordable. We must help it by taxation, by subsidies, by supporting farmers who produce that kind of food. And we must, maybe, yes, make bad junk food, soft drinks more expensive. I'm sorry to say this. For a special rapporteur on the food, to say this is quite striking. Right? But consider this as part of a proposal that has other components, right? My solution for Mexico is not to make food more expensive. My solution is to avoid prices that lie to our health, that lie to the collectivity, and that completely underestimate the costs for the collectivity of the way food is currently produced, processed, and sold. So in other terms, absolutely we need clean water, but we need this to be part of a broader strategy that leads to more healthy diets, and that will, be a very good investment, because if we calculate the costs on public health of, overweight and obesity, translated into type D diabetes and the dialysis that this requires, cancers related to bad junk food, and cardiovascular diseases, the costs for the collectivity are immense, right? And it certainly would be much less costly to prevent this by adequate nutrition policies. But again, I think we cannot just tackle, what's on these labels. We also have to see this as part of a much broader, more ambitious program. This is why we need a national strategy. And this is my final comment. I was really interested in many things I heard from both organizations like yours and the authorities in my state, Mexico. But what I'm struck by, and this I told to the authorities I met already quite frankly, is that these policies are in silos. They are sectorialized. It's not part of a global approach that moves the country in the right direction. So for example, trade policies lead people in the urban centers to feed themselves with imported processed foods. in many cases weaning the small farmers, and then you have social programs that seek to compensate for these farmers becoming poor, and you have, you know, health programs that seek to come at the rescue of those who are sickened by the processed foods that they eat, right? So this is not particularly consistent. And it is this kind of inconsistency that a much more integrated approach should serve. There are beginnings of this, right? The National Development Plan 2007-2012 could be transformed into a strategy that is focused on the right to food. And now that the country has adopted the constitutional amendments, and that the right to food is part of your internal legal order, I think now is the time to make this, you know, the main focus of your efforts. Because in this national strategy, you can tackle many of the issues you've been looking at, based on human rights, which are enforceable before Mexican courts. Right? Finally, let me say this: many of the things I've said will be detailed on Monday and will be detailed in my report. I count on you. Frankly, I mean, I'm very flattered by the sort of hopes you put in my mission. But really, you are the agents that can have an impact on the mission, in the sense that many efforts I can do multiplied by 0 will lead to nothing. And you are the multiplier, right? So the more you do, the more my recommendations can have an impact. And if you do nothing, they will not be heard. So it's very important for my missions to be built upon by civil society. International supervision is not particularly helpful. It is short-term, generally. The attention span of the international community is very short. So my missions only work in countries such as this one, where the civil society is well organized and wishing to invest time and energy into this. So I would like to end in 5 minutes, and because I asked a few questions, so to give you time to answer, I spoke too much, I'm told.